Hello, and welcome to Stories from India, a podcast where we talk about myths, legends, and folk tales from India. I am your host, Narad Muni, and I'm a mythological character myself. I have the gift of eternal life and knowledge of the past, the present, and the future. By profession, I'm a traveling musician and a storyteller. So, the way I'm doing my job is by podcast. Before we begin today's episode, I have a question for you about the format of the show. Basically, I need your opinion. Would you prefer a single longer episode every week or two shorter ones? Let me know what you think by messaging me on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, or leave a comment on the website sfipodcast.com. Moving on to today's episode, we are going to cover the ancient Indian version of Star Wars. If you have not watched the original Star Wars movies, I highly recommend that you check them out. Amongst other things, there's a central character who starts off good, then he becomes a bad guy, before he turns good again. That's kind of what today's story is about. We are talking about Angulimala. But that's not his real name, just as Darth Vader was not really Anakin Skywalker's name. Our story begins in the kingdom of Kosala. One stormy night, there was reason to celebrate in the home of Bhargav, the royal priest. That's because the priest's wife had just given birth to a healthy baby boy. The priest had another reason to be happy. Being an astrologer, he was almost certain he knew what lay in his son's future. Sure, it was a stormy night, but astrologers know what the positions of the stars are without having to actually look up at the sky. So Bhargav knew from the positions of the stars that his son was going to be a great scholar and one of the best in the country. Probably. The truth is, there were just a couple of possibilities he had not been able to rule out. If a purple horse were to jump over the rose bushes in his yard tomorrow, that might mean the boy was destined to be a stand-up comedian. Not the absolute worst profession in the world. The other possibility that Bhargav had not been able to rule out was much, much worse. But also extremely unlikely. The priest slept peacefully that night, completely leaving his baby's care to his wife, despite her postnatal condition. So much for being an empathetic husband. But it was the last time he would sleep peacefully. The very next morning, he received a summons from the king himself. And when it's a summons from the king, you cannot ignore it, even if you are on your paternity leave. Despite the summons, Bhargav was in a very cheerful mood. His wife and son were healthy. His son was going to grow up to be a great scholar. And Bhargav himself had just earned 16 weeks of paid parental leave, during which he'd leave all the caring of the baby to others while he could have a real vacation. What more could he ask for? "Your Majesty, how may I serve you today?" he asked the king, after greeting him in the throne room. I want you to explain something, said the king. Something very strange happened last night. Some of our soldiers reported something really odd. A UFO? Asked Bhargav. No, no, nothing that fancy. The royal painter was around, so we commissioned him to paint a picture on the spot. Here, take a look. Bhargav looked at the oil painting on canvas. It showed two soldiers looking up, open mouthed, because there was a glowing bright blue light around the tips of the spears that they were holding. Bhargav was taken aback. This exact phenomenon was part of the other possibility he had feared. But it still remained extremely unlikely. It's Saint Elmo's fire, Your Majesty, he said. Saint Elmo? Elmo from Sesame Street? That annoying red puppet character is a saint? Asked the king, incredulously. No, no, this is a different Elmo, Your Majesty. This is Saint Elmo, the patron saint of sailors. It's because Saint Elmo's fire is commonly observed by sailors who thought Saint Elmo was visiting them and blessing their ships. I don't buy that, said the king. Whatever it is, that's not fire. It's only been called that, Your Highness. It's just a natural weather phenomenon. Charge builds up at the edges and makes it glow when it interacts with air. You mean lightning? Asked the king. No, Your Majesty. Lightning is different. Look, I'll bring over some physics textbooks to you later. First, I have an important question. This wasn't by any chance the North Tower, was it? You know what? Forget I even asked that. The North Tower has been blocked off for years. That was silly of me to ask that question. No, no, Bhargava. But it was the North Tower, said the king. It was off limits for years, yes. But yesterday, on a hunch, I sent these two soldiers to check it out. At that, Bhargava started getting a sick feeling in his stomach. The one possibility he dreaded, that he had not been able to rule out, if two soldiers were to experience Saint Elmo's fire in the abandoned North Tower, and if the king were to have mangoes for breakfast the next morning, his son would not be a scholar. Instead, he would be a ruthless bandit. But that was still unlikely. Who would eat mangoes for breakfast anyway? Besides, the mango season was over. Your Highness, said Bhargav, if you don't mind me asking, did you have a good breakfast this morning? As a matter of fact, yes, said the king. Amazed, because it seemed like Bhargav had correctly guessed at so much. It was an unusual breakfast, but extremely good. What was unusual about it, Your Highness? Asked Bhargav. But he thought he already knew. I had a friend send over a whole crate of mangoes last night, the very last of the season. They wouldn't last long without refrigeration, so I had to eat them all this morning. What's the matter, Bhargav? You look sick. It must be the stress of being a new dad, Your Highness. Excuse me, Your Highness. You wouldn't happen to have a purple horse in your stables, would you? A purple horse? Asked the king, amazed. I never heard they came in that color. Of course I don't have one. Maybe try the circus in town. Or try the yellow pages. Bhargav excused himself and then made for the circus, then the stables, the race course, the zoo, but no one had such a horse. He finally located one many towns away, but there was no way to get the horse over in time to jump over the rose bushes in his yard today. It was a hopeless case. Dejected, he went home and realized he would have to accept his son's fate. His darling baby boy was going to be an absolutely terrifying villain. He was quite disturbed, and soon the king noticed that, especially because Bhargav chose to give up his parental leave and report into work the very next day. On inquiring, Bhargav explained everything and asked the king if his son could be preemptively jailed. Bhargav, don't be ridiculous. Your son is just 2 days old. Let's see if we can't work out something else. For a start, how bad of a robber is he going to be? Like Robin Hood? If so, we might be able to live with that. Bhargav shook his head and said, Worse, much worse, Your Majesty. Well, then tell me this. Is he going to lead other criminals, or is he going to rob by himself? By himself, Your Highness. Well, then that settles it. It's wrong to punish someone for something they haven't yet done. I know they tried it in Minority Report, but that's just a movie. Besides, our prisons aren't equipped to handle babies. Take care of him, Bhargav, and keep nudging him in the right direction. For example, maybe you should name him Ahimsaka. A most excellent suggestion, Your Highness, said Bhargav, though he didn't really mean that. He had his heart set on calling the boy Anakin Skywalker. But when the king suggests something, you have to obey it. So Ahimsaka it was. The name means someone who practices non-violence. That's what the king had meant by nudging him. Years passed, and the boy grew up. He was a very good student. The boy read just about every book in the library. His father did try and keep away any weapons from the boy. So no lightsabers, or bows, or swords, or spears. Bhargav began to think that maybe he had been wrong about his prediction after all. He expressed this to his wife, Mantani. I agree with you, she said. The way he built the robo C3PO and the pod race that he piloted and won? What are you talking about? Asked Bhargav. Wait, replied Mantani, quickly picking up her copy of the script. Oops, I got my dialogues crossed. Wrong episode. I meant to say, yes, dear husband. It seems likely that you were wrong. It's also quite possible it was because of the gentle nudges over the years. Much better, said Bhargav. I've been thinking he should go to the best university in the world, at Takshila. He's already aced his SATs. Manthani agreed. Ahimsaka was born to do this, she thought. She knew he would do well. So at that young age, the boy set out from his home and his kingdom, where all he had were the same million books that he had read over and over dozens of times. Now, he was going to learn a bunch more at university. In between parties, college sports, and other activities completely unsupervised by parents. Little did he know what was in store for him. We'll pause it there. We'll continue the story in the next episode, where we'll see how Ahimsaka transforms into one of the worst villains ever. Saint Elmo's fire that I mentioned earlier is a real thing. Check out the links on the site for some pictures. If you have comments or suggestions, or if there are particular stories you'd like to hear, please do let me know by leaving a comment or a review on the site sfipodcast.com or tweet at sfipodcast. You can also find me on Instagram and Facebook. And just as a reminder, please do let me know what format of the show you prefer by messaging me or leaving a comment on the site. Be sure to subscribe to the show to get notified automatically of new episodes. Thanks to all of you listeners for your wonderful support and your feedback. The music is from purpleplanet.com. That's purple-planet.com. I'll see you next time.